Hi guys, I'm Dr. Tara Tobias. I want to welcome you all back to this channel. This week's video is part 2 in a series that I started last week, going over how to dissociate or isolate body segments. If you haven't watched last week's video, I highly encourage you to stop this video right here and go back and watch that video first, because it's going to make this video make a whole lot more sense. Now, I ended that video a little bit awkwardly and abruptly, and as I mentioned last week, it's just because it was getting a little bit too long. And as I mentioned last week, I like to break things down into little chunks just to make them a little bit easier to absorb and actually apply and get the most benefit out of the activities. So just to review, dissociation is isolating one body segment. A lot of times after a neurologic injury, body segments kind of link together. We call that abnormal movement coupling. And yes, there are times when that's beneficial, and there is what they call like normal movement coupling, where you want things to link together. But there are also times when that's not ideal. So for instance, if you've got upper body movements and lower body movements linking together, that's not really ideal for walking, reaching into a cabinet, doing your normal daily activities. So the goal is to dissociate body segments, isolate body movement. And just a very quick review, what I mentioned last week, the rationale behind how I progress activities. I like to do things laying down, then sitting, then standing. You're moving from a position where you're relatively stable, so your arms and your legs can move from a relatively stable base when you're laying down. Sitting takes away some of that stability from your trunk, but it still keeps your lower half really stable. And then standing really requires all the muscles around the core and in the hips to maintain that stability when you try and move the arms and the legs. And so that's why standing activities are always in the final steps of most of the progressions that I do. So today's going to be a few more of the sitting activities, and then we're going to jump right into standing. But before we dive into the content of this video, if you're new to my channel and you haven't yet subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell so that you'll be notified every time I upload new videos. And now let's go ahead and dive into the content of this video. So just to review, in last week's video, I went through some laying down exercise where you isolate lower body movement while blocking the upper extremities, and then you progress that to isolating lower body movement and removing some of the tools that I used to block arm movement, and then ultimately combining movements. So combining upper body and lower body movements, doing opposite things. And then that's really where we left off. And then in today's video, we're going to pick up with some kneeling and half kneeling activities, and of course standing. So tall kneeling is when you're up on both knees and just doing opposite movements with the arms. So the knees are bent, so keeping the knees bent and just extending one arm, extending the other arm. I like to do that. Rotating the upper body, where when you're on your knees, your lower body is going to be more like immobilized just because of the floor and your body weight. It's not going to be able to move very much. So learning how to dissociate upper body movement from lower body movement. And you can do a bunch of different things with this. I've done a whole video on tall kneeling. In that video, I also go over like dual tasks. So adding a thinking task or adding an actual purposeful activity adds another thinking challenge, which is another level of difficulty. So you're splitting your attention between a movement activity and a thinking activity, which can make it a little bit more challenging. I will put a link for the tall kneeling video in the description below. You can also do half kneeling, which is dissociating the lower extremities. So half kneeling is where you're just on one knee. And I would just hold this, and I would get really good at holding this. So a lot of times what happens if you can't dissociate the lower extremities, you can't hold this position. The hip that is extended, so the knee that's on the ground, that hip wants to flex because the other hip is flexed. So just holding this position is a huge challenge. So again, you can hold this position. You've dissociated the lower extremities. They're doing opposite movements, and do a variety of things with the upper extremities to just add in additional challenges. Now, the lower extremities are pretty much in a static position when you're just holding this position. So to make it more dynamic and add another layer of difficulty, now you could try these step throughs. So I've showed this in other videos as well. I will also put a link for a half kneeling video in the description below where you can see more activities that I do, also how to get into this position and how to get out of this position. But yeah, you can progress to step through. So now it's dynamic, you're actually having to move. And again, the key would be when you bring that leg forward, that the other side doesn't collapse. So I know I'm gonna get this question like, which leg is the involved leg? Which leg is the uninvolved leg? For this purpose of dissociating, there isn't really an involved leg and uninvolved leg. You're really trying to get the segments to do opposite movements at the same time. So I would do this one on both sides. Have the uninvolved knee down and have the involved knee down. So do it all on one side and then switch sides and try some of these activities on the other side. Now, in my experience, it is going to be more difficult to have the involved knee down. It's just a really hard position. It challenges the hip. There's usually some hip weakness after any type of an event that caused hemiplegia or weakness on one side of the body. That hip is usually a little bit weaker. So whether that's a brain injury or a stroke or even MS, depending on where your lesions are, that could just affect one side. Usually the involved side of that hip is a little bit weaker. So there's a variety of reasons why having the involved knee down might be a little bit more challenging, but just be prepared for that side is gonna be a little bit harder, but I would do them on both sides. So then in sitting, a few positions that I like is if you are someone where your leg shoots out, the lower the chair, the better, because your feet are closer to the ground and the ground almost stops any movement. So the more bent your hips and your knees are, it really holds those legs in place and prevents them from shooting out. So I like to have people get all the way into squatting. I use this tool called a spine corrector. I'm actually working on a whole video just using this one piece of equipment. I love it. I use it a lot. Usually I'm inspired by a patient that I'm working with where I'm using it quite a bit, and then that reminds me just how much I love it. I kind of go through phases, and right now it's one of my favorite pieces of equipment just for positioning purposes, stretching, and really isolating body segments. So again, look for that. I'm going to do a whole video just on this piece of equipment, but I love it because it's got this hump on it, so you can kind of get onto that first and then slide down onto this lower part, but you're in a really flexed position with your legs. So there's absolutely no way that leg is gonna shoot out or do anything crazy, and then you can work on upper body stuff or even just trunk rotation. Again, separating the upper body from the lower body, but you can also do a lot of arm activities down here as well. It's also a great stretch for the hips, but that would be one position that I like to get in to isolate just upper body movement. The other thing I suggest with sitting is always have the back supported, and sometimes even just putting a gait belt, strapping your lower body to the chair to really block movement, but it also gives your back some support, which will help you if you were just going to work on upper body movements. But a lot of times people extend, so I'm not really sure if that's an issue with not being able to separate the upper body from the lower body. But if that is you, and you wanted to just isolate your upper extremities, I would just find a belt or something and just kind of strap yourself to a chair with a backrest on it. So now standing. So this comes up probably more often than not. How to stop the arm from flexing up when you stand up and you walk. So this is for those of you that mention in your comments that it works fine when you're laying down, but as soon as you go to stand up and start walking is when the arm flexes up. That is most likely not a spasticity issue, and more likely probably an issue with the inability to dissociate or with movements coupling up. So I've done a couple of videos on how to stop the hand from coming up into the face, and in those videos I talk about using a dowel rod and putting your hands behind your back. I love that activity. It's the tool, just like we did stuff on the mat, using a tool to block the movements that we don't want. If you were going to work on stepping or single leg standing, that would be the tool that I would use to block the movements that you don't want to happen. Now, I also mentioned the next progression or the next level would be to remove the tool and try and actively hold the non-working extremities in the opposite position of what they are doing when you're attempting to do activities with the working part of the body. And so some suggestions I have for this is definitely, if you can, get that arm in a weight-bearing position. So I use a bedside table. If the arm can't stay straight, go back to the dowel rod. This is now for those of you that the arm stays straight when you're standing, but as soon as you go to step, it draws up. Definitely do a weight-bearing position. The other thing that I often do is I use this PVC frame. You guys have seen it a lot in other videos, but when I'm doing a flexion movement with the lower extremity, such as stepping either leg forward, I will actually have someone push the bar forward. So now you're trying to go opposite what that arm is normally trying to do, which is flex up. So now someone has to actively extend that arm. The benefit of this is that both arms are strapped to it, so you can kind of use your other arm to help a little bit to kind of feel that movement, or at least prevent it from drawing up. So I love that for those of you where you're trying to quiet the upper extremity down. Now, when it comes to the lower extremities, I use a knee immobilizer quite a bit. So that again is the tool that I'm using to kind of stop the abnormal movements that I don't want. So if I'm working on stepping with the involved leg or flexing with the involved leg, such as setting that foot up on a stool, initially I will put a knee immobilizer on the other leg. If I know that someone cannot dissociate the lower extremities and that leg is going to buckle, then I usually progress to more manual cueing. Where you would progress is just keep that knee immobilizer on until you don't feel the straps. This is the cue that I use with my patients in the clinic, until you don't feel your leg hitting those knee straps. So you'll feel it trying to bend in that knee immobilizer. So it's not a crutch, and it's not like a splint that's making the leg not active. It is a feedback tool. So you'll feel the front of your leg hit those straps on the front. That's why I love it. And you want to get to a point where you don't feel that. Now, if you're someone that your knee goes into hyperextension, this isn't for you. This is for those of you where that knee is buckling because your legs are trying to do the same thing at the same time. If that doesn't work, I would spend a whole lot more time in the kneeling and the half kneeling positions, trying to break up some of these segments or break up some of this coupling that's going on. You're lower to the ground, you're safer, your body's more relaxed, so you might have more success there. Always, always, always set yourself up for success. It's just reframing the way that you're viewing your rehab. So the immediate response that I get from a lot of my go-getter type patients is, I don't want to use that. Isn't that a crutch? Isn't that going to make me weaker? Things like that. And no, we're not strengthening. We're retraining the brain. We learn the same way from kindergarten throughout our lives. You wouldn't set a 5-year-old up for failure because they would just give up. They are not crutches. They are setting yourself up for success so the brain is in an environment where it has the potential to learn. Same things you do with kids, we learn the same way as adults. So they're not crutches, they are tools to set your body up for success. The more positive or successful experiences you have, the more that brain is going to rewire or hardwire that new movement into the hard drive. So they are tools, they are not crutches. Definitely use a knee immobilizer to start. Do that until you don't feel those straps or you don't feel that like that leg is flexing up in the brace. And you will know that because when it does flex up, you will feel those straps on the front of your leg. That is it. So just to summarize, this is only for dissociation. So I get this a lot in the comments when I show a new video, but I have this problem or that problem and I can't do these. This is only for those of you that fit the description, where you feel like body segments or regions of the body are coupling up together, meaning you cannot isolate one body segment, or you cannot get one extremity to move independent of the other extremity. That might mean that your movements are coupling, and therefore these would be some exercises to dissociate, get body segments to move independent of each other. Progression 1, you start by just isolating an extremity and using tools to block all the other extremities. Then you remove the tool, then you combine movements, so opposite movements on both sides of the body. You progress from laying down to sitting to standing. You can throw in tall kneeling and half kneeling. That's probably one step before standing. So if you go to standing, it's too difficult, drop back down to the kneeling and the half kneeling to really hardwire some of those movements, those isolated movements, onto that hard drive of your brain. Again, if you guys are new to my channel and you haven't yet subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Turn on that notification bell so that you will be notified every time I upload new videos. If you haven't signed up for my newsletter yet, the link is in the description below. I send out about 1 email a week, just with tips or suggestions or just a way to connect with you throughout the week. If you haven't visited the new website yet, check that out. Lots of great tools, exercises, free tips to help empower you to take control or take a little bit more ownership of your rehab. And then that is it for this video. I enjoyed spending time with you all today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. You all have a great day.